And
Right.
now that you've pointed that out, it's very easy to just ignore
Yeah.
anything they say because I can just say, oh, this is from so and so. This is
Right.
from I don't know who those guys are, but
And you said real damage to society from these two. So, and what to that I would say, well, it's not that you had to reverse their information or their what they were telling people. Where did the damage come from? Well, their influence on these parties that can go to war and inflict aggression onto people.
Welcome back to the Do Less podcast. We've been living up to our name and haven't recorded in a couple of months now, so it's good to be back with the crew. We have if you're a special guest here, Jack Epstein as well. He's going to be listening in, chiming in if he's got anything to say. But today we want to talk a little bit about misinformation and fake news. I was just talking to Jack at dinner tonight about how the first time I'd ever heard the phrase fake news was during Trump's 2016 election, when Trump started using the term fake news to kind of discredit like some fake news stories and some actual facts, and it became sort of a joke of a term to say something is fake news because Trump would just take any actual facts about himself and call it fake news, and common sense and left wing people would look at him and say like, come on, you're just discrediting everything anyone says by using the term fake news, and that term became a joke. But now, as of late, and with when the left-wing media and anybody, even centrist, now on subjects like coronavirus and anything else, now use a similar discrediting technique using the terminology of misinformation, which is really saying the same exact thing as fake news, but just using another term because the term fake news has been sort of tainted by Donald Trump. I think it's kind of hilarious just to kind of rebrand the same idea. But I think what it really brings into question is kind of who decides what is true and what's misinformation is an interesting question we kind of have to ask ourselves. And I think it sort of puts the onus on the reader to do their own sort of research and background checking. But in any event, we've seen both right and left sides of the aisle sort of using terms like fake news and misinformation to sort of brush past facts or arguments from the other side, which is maybe an interesting place to start. Just the fact that there is a different terminology used by the different sides, I think, makes people talk past each other. But in any event, you guys have any takes on that?
Well, misinformation is clearly like fancy, so like that's smart, right? Like fake news, that sounds dumb, so it's like that's clearly wrong. But misinformation, that's like sophisticated, like lots of syllables.
It's the fancy
Definitely
fake news.
Being used appropriately. But yeah, no, I agree with what you said. Is like it is funny that like fake news became a meme that I use all the time. when someone says something I don't like, I'll just say fake news. But now it's like people want to talk about misinformation all the time. I hear it all the time. It's like the new buzzword. And like you said, it's like, okay, yeah, it's a slightly more sophisticated word, but you're talking about the same exact thing. And so, I mean, ultimately it comes down to like, there's a lot of rhetoric of like, okay, we need to deal with this misinformation, right? We need like fact checkers. We need to sort out the misinformation from the information and the disinformation. And I think ultimately the obvious question is, okay, who decides what is information versus misinformation? Like who's deciding truth? Like even if you develop like a ministry of truth who's like, okay, this is correct and this is wrong, ultimately if people don't trust that, then they're just gonna disagree with whatever they're deciding is true and not true. So ultimately, it's always just going to come down to the individual to decide what is true and what isn't true. And like you can present them information and misinformation and misinformation and all the other different informations you want, but like ultimately it's going to come down to the individual what they want to believe. So I don't know. I think any attempts to try to like get ahead of this problem are probably non-starters.
Futile efforts. Something we mentioned in the past on this show is the idea that like you can say a series of facts, one after the other, and the fact that you didn't say them in a different order, even like if there's 3 facts and you say A, C, and B, well, someone could say, well, why didn't you say A, B, C? You just became an editor, right? That is a form of editorializing, which some could say leads to a narrative, which others could say is a false narrative, and that is a false or fake news, right? It's as simple as displaying facts in the wrong order to give someone an impression that something is, according to a certain narrative. So I actually am of the opinion that fake news and misinformation is a good thing, because it teaches people to use their filters and their better judgment, and teaches people that you can't just read some sensational story and it's going to change your whole opinion or change the way you're going to live your life. You got to be a person who has the ability to see through what this idea that you can create like an okay news or like high fidelity news. It's like, well, no, it's all editorial to an extent. And so to the extent that people are reading the news and thinking, oh, this is factual and this is not factual, it's like none of it's factual. And the more fake news there is, the more the mask drops. Pun not intended, but kind of fits in a lot of ways. But the more the mask drops and allows people to, engage those filters that they're otherwise remaining dormant.
I'll take it even further, because like I hear Joe Rogan talking about this a lot, where he's like, back in the day we used to have Walter Cronkite, and everyone would sit down for the 6 o'clock news, and like you were getting facts, and you could trust that. And it's like, okay, maybe those events factually happened, but even just selecting what to talk about for an hour is biased. There's like no form of summarization that isn't going to be biased, because the amount of information out there like happening all the time is incomprehensible to any person. So just any act of trying to consolidate that information, just to say like, we don't talk about what I had for breakfast this morning on the news because no one cares. It's not relevant. But the closer you get to like what is relevant, that's where sort of the bias creeps in, is selecting, okay, and we were talking about this actually earlier before we started recording, is, Mexico is a country that is our neighbor. And how often do you hear any news about Mexico that isn't related to our border? Just news relevant to them. Almost never. Like, I can't think of it. And so that alone is a bias, just deeming all of that to be irrelevant, for news. So I think just even the concept, like people go, oh, we just need unbiased news. I don't think there's such a thing.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that's sort of pointless to try to hope for that day to come.
I totally agree with that. I think you've explained that to me in the past, and that sort of changed the way that I look at all the news and information that I see. In that, the way that I, in my own mind, summarize what you just said there is that, like, even if some source of news was purely objective fact, they're still choosing what not to report on in order to report on any fact. And so there could be genocide in Rwanda, but if they're reporting on coronavirus cases in Philadelphia, they're still selecting to talk about one rather than the other. And even if it's purely fact, there is bias that goes into what gets selected, which everyone should keep in mind. But I think, regardless of that fact, there is varying levels of objective fact or level of proof that can go into a news story that can vary between one news story and the next. And so I do believe there are some editorial and journalistic virtues in choosing to have well-researched and well-proven stories before you publish them, that I think are not necessarily adhered to today as much as they might have been in the past, or at least as much as they could potentially be in the future, and that's something worth striving towards. Even if you're going to select which stories to cover, I think there's varying levels of truth or of research you can and journalists can do themselves before publishing a story that I think is beneficial to the masses. Especially, I understand why you could take the position that having more fake news would teach people that they need to research what they read, but I don't know if that's effective in practice. I think there's a lot of people that increasingly want to have a diet of headline stories, and especially in a social media environment that caters towards outrage culture and stories that are worded in ways to cause outrage and bait clicks on the internet, which influences the way that populations think and treat one another, which is potentially dangerous and I think more net negative than it is beneficial.
Well, I want to make a point, which is that when you say it's dangerous, the only reason, so this is really interesting to think about, the only reason it can be dangerous for someone to take false information as truth and promulgate a narrative that's not true is when that person has power over you and can affect your life in a way that will affect you to a certain extent, or to some extent violently, right? In those cases, you have to say, wow, these people are straight up wrong, and we have to do something about that because they're going to go and enact legislation that's going to affect me, right? If that person didn't have any power over me, then I don't care what they think. You know what I mean? As long as they're not enacting some way of violence, some kind of form of violence in its entirety, in their action. I didn't really say that well, but you get what I mean.
But John, to that point, if you're talking about
the way that people can have... Apps, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit, this much.
Yeah.
Get closer.
To that point about power structures, I totally agree with that. Where I disagree is it's not only the people you think of as legislators with power. So if you have certain people who have power, whereas for example, in New Zealand, in Christchurch, or in Pittsburgh, where someone, based off of misinformation, has such a disenchanted view of someone, they kill someone else. That person didn't have legislative power over someone else, but they were still able to inflict massive harm over them because of information they got that was blatantly
I would argue everyone has legislative power to some extent, because you essentially vote for your legislators to a degree. So,
yeah, that's what I was referring to. Not even people in power, people that are just your neighbors. They have the ability to band together and put someone in office that's going to do something to me that I wouldn't otherwise, would be able to stop because they're going to enact violence on me. So the fact that they can inflict violence on me means that I have to worry about what they're thinking. So, and what I'm trying to point out in my first statement was that it's impossible for me to deliver them a fact, 100% true narrative that's going to, well, it wouldn't be a narrative, just 100% true statements to them and say, here you go, here's your news now I don't have to worry about you. It's no, that's never going to happen. It's impossible. So that being said, that being the case, the only conclusion, and I'd like to come to this conclusion more eloquently, but hopefully you can kind of see how I'm getting. The only conclusion is that we need to disarm the violence that we have over each other. we need to become more individualistic and less aggressive.
So I know where you're headed with this, and it's essentially, your argument would be if the government or whatever, local, state, or federal had less power over us, then it would be less relevant if people were misinformed because they wouldn't, be voting incorrectly, and then those guys would not be exerting power over us. Which I do agree to an extent, but I don't completely agree with that, because if you go back to like Jim Crow era, that while Jim Crow was a government, structure,
sanctioned, yeah,
not all of like the violence that was taking place was state sponsored, right? Like you had collections of people in like the KKK just forming mobs together and lynching people because of their ignorance and stupidity and hatred. And so you could say those people were misinformed, and that led them to be violent in their own way that didn't necessarily need the state to sponsor their violence. I guess the state in some ways looked the other way, and that's a problem, but I don't think you can completely reduce it down to the state and say, oh, if the state has less power, the problem is solved, and it doesn't matter if people are misinformed and hateful, because I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay, yeah, I get, like, yeah, you're right. So I guess to clarify, what I'm trying to back into is the statement that examples of aggression are always, like, it's like this, the the conclusion you can make is examples of aggression are always the problem. Like that's the stem of the issue. It's not the misinformation. So if there's people that are organizing through aggression and exerting aggression, then if your lone principle in society is like, hey, these aggressors are the problem, then you can, with that as a rule, you actually would be able to, everyone would recognize that those people like the KKK are actually doing wrong. And it's still not, you don't care what they think, if they're, as long as they're not aggressing, that's the difference I'm trying to make. Like someone who is like racist or has bad thoughts or has misinformation, it's like they're never a problem as long as they're not aggressing. So you can never get rid of misinformation, but you can get rid of aggression, because aggression is like you can witness. Misinformation, you'll never be able to exonerate.
I agree with that to an extent, but I don't think you just throw your hands up and say they're ignorant, we can't fix them. But I would say you don't fight it with force, but you should try to inform, like you should try to fight like their ignorance and hopefully make them better people, because you don't really just want your neighbors to be a bunch of like ignorant, hateful people, even if they never are violent towards you. Like, is that ultimately what you want, like out of the people around you?
Right.
Like,
yeah, that's not what you want.
I agree.
Well,
I think.
So I'm just saying, you should want to fight misinformation, but again, like I would just say I disagree, and here's why, and I would lay out my argument. I wouldn't call someone misinformed, because how are you ever going to convince someone or persuade them if your starting point is like you're a moron?
Right, you have to prove it.
I mean? Like,
I think a difference between what you and I are thinking here, John, is that I think we both agree that like different sets of facts and general confusion between people or groups of people is what often leads to violence. And so having misunderstandings of each other and each other's perspectives and logic often leads to violence. And one way to reduce that is to like strip them of power. But I think another way to reduce that, I think we would both agree, is to help clarify facts and get more factual information to both parties so they can, better understand one another. I think I am the point I was originally making is that one route towards a better informed populace on either side of any issue is less misinformation / fake news, or in other words, more scrutinized and edited, journalistic stories of journalistic integrity. But your point is a way to a more informed public is, in fact, quite the opposite, in that by having a influx of fake news, individuals are then required to fact check all stories that they read, and are therefore doing their own research. But I don't think that is in practice an effective way of having a more informed public, and therefore less violent people.
Well, now, I'll clarify that. Or go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, like, when you disagree with people, you should be able to just speak your mind and they speak your mind and figure it out, right? And civilly, not violently. You don't try to force your opinion on them, and they don't try to force theirs on you. And that's the best way to proceed, right? And maybe no one walks away convinced, but as soon as one side tries to either silence the other or just say, you're wrong, we know you're wrong, so that's it, like, you're not going to talk, this is misinformation, we're just going to take this off the internet, whatever it be. Like, you're not going to ever convince those people. You're only going to make them dig in more to their side. So that's just never going to be the answer. So I almost think, like, the term misinformation is, like, not useful, right? Unless it's within your, like, little echo chamber of people who all agree. Other than that, like, there's no, like, when would you ever go into an argument with someone and say you're misinformed, unless your intention is to basically ridicule them and, just score points or whatever.
Yeah, so it's like
actually trying to change someone's opinion. Term. Yeah, because you're basically saying you're too stupid to see the difference between fact and fiction by saying you're misinformed. So it's like, it's kind of a loaded term. It's not so bad, but it's gotten so overused at this point that I feel like it's almost insulting when it's like you just say you're just misinformed, you bought all this misinformation. You're basically calling them a fool rather than just saying, like, you can just skip all that and say, okay, I hear your argument, but here's mine.
Right. I think
and if you are persuasive, maybe you can get someone now on your side.
It's equally as much of a brush off as saying, like, someone says makes some point or argument and you just say fake news. Right? It's like just saying like, nah, fuck you, you're wrong. Like, but even worse than that, it's like you're misinformed. And saying misinformed is, like we said at the start, is equivalent to saying, fake news. And so it's like, okay, don't just say, nah, you're wrong. Like, explain, poke holes in my argument where you rightly can present, counter arguments and make your point. But don't just tell me I'm misinformed because you don't like my source. Tell me what's right or wrong about it.
Yeah, like, for me, like, intellectual discourse is, like, I can't even place it, like, I can't emphasize how high I place that in terms of, like, importance in, like, a functioning society. And so, yeah, like, any kind of, non-integrity or lack of integrity for, like, journalists and, like, actual fake news spreading, it's like, yeah, that's a problem, but the only time you need to actually, like, you have to start talking about your, like, winning strategy. It's like, okay, this is the problem. We have all this journalistic lack of integrity. It's like, how do we address that? It's like, well, we got to write that with real news, and we got to go do the real journalism. And it's like, okay, well, that's a whole can of worms. Like, that's not, to say that's the winning strategy. It's like, well, you haven't even defined anything. Like, that's actually, you can't even place your finger on that. So what I'm saying is, like, if you want a winning strategy in terms of, like, how should society operate based on, here's the problem, fake news. It's like, well, isolate the fake news that has led to forms of aggression. And it's like, now target that with intellectual discourse, right? And if all of society operated that way, it's like the game theory would actually you would actually work out the most important places of fake news, which is leading people to violence. And once you work those out, then you can kind of have the benefit of like, oh, now the intellectual discourse is about like philosophy and like stuff that no one's actually going to arms about. Like you kind of whittle away the important fake news by using that lens. And so that's what I'm introducing in the conversation. Like the lens is what is leading to people to aggression, and that is the stuff that you have to address through information, discourse, all that sort of stuff.
I guess, John, I have a question, because I do mostly agree with you. How do you kind of handle people who are intentionally bad actors in that game, though, where they're deliberately trying to confuse people, whether it's just because they know that there's profit to be had in, spurring some anger, or they just kind of want to have followers on Twitter, where if you just basically say, all right, we have someone saying something that is just like patently false because they want to get attention, and someone saying, no, actually, here are the facts, like, I have evidence you're wrong. Like, having just like an intellectual discourse where they kind of meet in the middle, to me feels dishonest, where I agree that Jeff's point is totally right. You can't just like tell people, oh, you're an idiot. Like, they're going to double down, but kind of is just agreeing to kind of meet in the middle always fair when where maybe one person's acting in bad faith? Because the only way to counterweight someone acting in terrible faith, if you want to meet in what you view as the appropriate middle, is to act in equally bad faith on the other side. And I think that is probably the most like accurate summary of where we are now, is you see someone like say something patently ridiculous, so someone just like throws out whataboutism and says something equally ridiculous to kind of try to recenter, and then we just like lose all sense of reality.
So I didn't catch all that, and I couldn't really hear the second half of it. But what I kind of interpret your question as like, how do you handle someone who's not just a bad journalist or accidentally like someone who's actually misinforming for the purpose of continuing a narrative that is neglect of reality. And to that, again, with my lens that I was just mentioning, you would treat that person, if that person is promulgating fake news with the intent of calling to action violence, you would treat that person as a violent actor because they are leading to violence. Like that person who is, essentially calling to action violence, you got to treat that no different than doing the violence. And so so like any places of aggression, you can just kind of whittle everything away into like who is being aggressed upon, and then use that as a filter, and then beyond, or like apart from that, like step down from that. If there is an actual violence, then you're free to just discuss with them and use logic and persuasion to try to either outdo them through journalism or make them irrelevant through well-crafted arguments. You can kind of discredit them without any kind of call to like they're just fake, don't listen to them. Say here's why they're wrong, here's why this doesn't make any sense, here's why you create better forms of information to outdo them.
So Jack, your point actually brings up like a concept that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is just trust and how it functions in like markets and politics and things like that. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is trust can be given to an individual, but it can also be given to a brand or a group or an organization. And so the New York Times is not a person. Like there's been many different people running the New York Times, working for the New York Times, etc. But people will give their trust to the New York Times. And I think giving your trust to an organization or a brand is something you have to be really careful with, because individuals tend to be more consistent with trust, I think. Like, if you find an individual who you find to be trustworthy, then until they've broken your trust, you can tend to trust them. That we all do this. We all have friends, family, etc. that we do this with. And so once that trust is broken, that person then has to like make it up to you, right? And then otherwise you sort of burn them. But when you give your trust to like an organization, then organizations it tends to have to hit a critical mass of breaking your trust before you burn them, and that's tricky because then you can sort of collect. This is like a weird term they call rent seeking in like economics. It doesn't mean like paying rent, but essentially there is an opportunity for rent seeking in terms of brands or organizations. In that, let's say you have some super trustworthy journalists who everyone loves, great reporting, and they start a company, and they start the New York Times, whoever started it, and they were just the best journalists. Then that brand is going to have a lot of trust associated with it, and they might hire people, and they might hire great people. But when that person dies, and they're replaced, they change things up, whatever, new management, that trust lingers, even though it may no longer be merited, because it may have all been to that individual. And now you suddenly have individuals who could be acting in bad faith and essentially abusing that trust. They go, we know they trust us, so we're not going to check this source. We're going to push them down this way, whatever you have it. I'm not accusing them of doing it, but I'm just saying, here's another trite example. You have Spotify's top 100 songs in the U.S., and that's probably just the top 100 songs by plays. But let's say Spotify gets into the music producing business, and they produce a song, and they go, well, we have the top 100. Why don't we just put it at the 100 spot, even if it didn't get the plays? That's going to boost its views because people check out the chart and go, I want to hear the top song. So now suddenly it's in the top songs. It's going to get more plays. That's going to generate them revenue. So they're essentially collecting rent on their trust of giving people the top songs to pocket some revenue by compromising that chart. It's no longer what they advertise it to be, and they're able to collect on that. And so I think trust can be abused, and you have to be really careful about trusting organizations unless you know the individual people and their roles at that organization. So, I mean, if you read an article and you really like it, I think you should read the journalist's name. I feel like a lot of people don't do that. Read their name, follow them, see what else they write. Give more of your trust to that journalist than you do their employer. And I think that will help like a lot of this because, they're good journalists, they're bad journalists. You put them all under the same roof and call it all the same credibility. I think that's playing a dangerous game.
I like that example. And I want to further the example to kind of solidify the illustration of my point. So let's say that that occurs. Spotify puts a song at number 10, and it wasn't even enough to crack the top 100, right? It's that's not a problem. Spotify is actually acting in its own interest to make money, and help the producer or help the artist of the song that it produced, right? And if Spotify does that over a long time, there's a free market where another service can come along and be like, their ratings, they're getting kickbacks. We're going to do an actual rating that people are actually going to look at they have a chance to get outcompeted. The problem comes in if there's a group of people that come along and say, not only do we love that this song got number 10, we're actually going to take political office on the platform that this song is the number 10 in the country. And it's and then so all of a sudden it's well, now the people that say, no, it's not number 10 in the country, well, they're at risk of these people coming into power over them. And they say, no. You guys are formulating, or you guys are circling on this fact, which is not actually true, and we really don't want you guys to do this because if you do get power, now it's considered like fraud, or it's like false that you guys were able to gain power over this agreed upon idea that's not actually true.
I guess the summary of my point, I think the Spotify example is a great example. I think it's a very smart way to think about it. I think talking about like New York Times and WMDs is also really smart. My fear with that argument, and it's not, I don't have the right answer, but just my fear with the argument is applying the highest level of skepticism to previously trusted sources that had built trust, while at the same time giving trust to individual sources who may not have deserved it. So when I was talking about individuals who have gained trust that didn't deserve it, like I'll give two concrete examples, one on the left, one on the right. Sean King and Mike Lindell. Both people who do not deserve any trust, yet have weirdly gained a lot of political trust. So Sean King on the far left gained a massive following on Twitter. He was basically just fundraising and keeping the funds for himself. Like, he would spew up headlines that would enrage people. He would collect funds, say he was giving them out to charities, and he was not doing that. And then Mike Lindell is literally selling pillows, and he is talking about conspiracies about the election where his goal is, I mean, maybe it's more clear to me than it is to other people. His goal is not to overturn the election results. I don't think he cares remotely either way. He wants to sell pillows, and he has realized that he's actually doing that very, very well. And if his pillow sales stay up, he's going to continue to talk about the things he talks about because that is what's good for his business. And both of these guys have done real damage to society. So I don't have a good answer, but I think there is a false dichotomy of giving bad actors the benefit of the doubt while applying extreme skepticism to people who had previously been relatively good actors, even if I agreed that appropriate skepticism should be... I'd rather give appropriate skepticism to everyone than just believe everyone and then figure it out from there.
Well, no, right. So what I'm saying is...
My point wasn't to...
Go ahead, Jeff.
My point wasn't to just trust individuals over brands. My point was, you just pointed out two good arguments as why you shouldn't trust those individuals. And now that you've pointed that out, it's very easy to just ignore anything they say, because I can just say, oh, this is from so-and-so. This is from... I don't know who those guys are. But,
and you said real damage to society from these two. So, to that I would say, well, it's not that you had to reverse their information or what they were telling people. Where did the damage come from? Well, their influence on these parties that can go to war and inflict aggression onto people, that's the source of the damage on society. It wasn't the fact that they actually did the damage by just saying bad things or wrong things. Their ability to persuade a group of people who then led to aggression, that was the damage to society. So like Jeff said, if you just tune those people out, you don't have to worry about it unless they're speaking to people who then come to your doorstep and commit aggression on you.
But you two are smart enough to tune them out. I think a lot of people are not smart enough to tune them out, which is a
but you don't care
problem.
unless they're aggressive.
And also, so like you said, you presented an argument as to why those people should not be trusted. I'm not familiar with them, so I don't really want to speak on this specifically. But let's say you have a good argument, you shouldn't trust these people, and it's like, okay, I hear your argument, I don't trust them. You can just write them off and not listen to them. Whereas the New York Times, you might say, okay, here they reported this bad info. Well, you could say, oh, well, that was just Sally. They fired Sally. So now we can trust them. But we don't necessarily know, like, their system or their operating procedures have been fixed. Like, just because they fired one person who did a bad job doesn't mean they're not going to hire someone to replace them who's also going to do a bad job. So my point is, it's harder to determine with organizations if, like, you should no longer trust them anymore or whatever, because they're more complex. So it's more difficult to sort of identify, should I place my faith in this? So I think you should treat organizations like just conglomerate, like finders, right? So if you if you like the New York Times, you should like them for their ability to find talented journalists and then follow those journalists. You shouldn't just say, oh, this is in the New York Times, I like the New York Times. It should more so be, okay, here's the New York Times, they got this journalist I like, and this journalist I like, and this, and maybe they introduce you to the new one, and then you follow them and you like them. I think you should just pay more attention. People should pay more attention to the individual, because that's going to have a probably pretty big impact on whether or not you should take their word for it. Or at least you can track their biases and know where they're coming from more easily.
I generally agree with that, but I think the natural thing to do is when one news source like the New York Times provides you with, 5 out of 6 journalists that you see on their site, you trust and like their content, then you see a new one pop up on a story that's relevant to you, you're going to say, like, odds are that they vetted that person equally, or that they went through the same editorial process in order to publish their article, and that carries some trust weight with it, which I think is somewhat justified. And I think our human attribute of trust is like a natural efficiency giver to us as humans, right? And that, like, it is very costly for us to fact check every piece of information that comes across our face. Obviously, like you said, especially in today's day and age, we're seeing more and more, like, overall content and just a higher dose of information. And it's very costly for us as individuals to truly fact check each piece of information that we see. And so at some point we need to place trust in people, and beyond that in organizations. And we should have a better way of evaluating, levels of trust in organizations, because I think, like you said, with individuals, if they lie or cheat once, we pretty quickly write them off permanently. But if a organization lies or gets a story wrong once, we don't as quickly write them off permanently. But I think, John, to your earlier point of more fake news leading people to then be more scrutinizing of the information that they see as being beneficial, I'm still not convinced that that's the case, because I think it's so costly for us to have to background check every piece of information we see, and then background check the background checking we did. It is so costly to the individual that it comes to a point where you throw your hands up and say, I don't really know what's true and what isn't. And so
let me clarify. When I
there's
say
some
that,
trust required.
When I say that, like, you introduce new filters, I'm not, like, there's, like, kind of a two-dimensional aspect, right? So if before in your life you used the New York Times stream as, like, your truth that, like, dictated your life, right? And you just took it all as fact, and then you read something that was wrong from them, and then so now you have to start fact checking, right? You could kind of do, like, on one axis, you could say, I'm going to keep it in that position in my life as the source of truth, but now I have to do exponentially more work because I have to check every single fact. What I'm saying is, you're going to do less work, but you're also going to do less work, and you're also going to lessen its ability to impact your life, right? So it's not like you're saying, like, all the new stories that I have to do, like, I have to read every sentence and go fact check every single line. It's like you read it now and it's like, I don't think this is the truth anymore, but I'm not going to, or I don't think that this is a true fact, and it's okay because I'm not treating this as, like, a directive on my life. Like, I'm going to treat this as just someone's opinion or someone's editorial that I'm going to take with a grain of salt and say, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, and kind of just introduce that skepticism, which actually removes a lot of need for fact checking when you read everything like just ideas, and you're taking ideas out of it.
And so you're saying everything will require less fact checking if you allow everything to have less impact on what you believe. And so, in other words, take everything with a grain of salt. Assume everything has some level of bias and opinion in it. And so no matter what you read, say, hey, that may or may not be true, but that's an interesting take. And if it's something that I'm going to allow to have a big impact on the way that I see the world, then I'll do more fact checking.
Yeah, exactly.
I would go on to say is you have to kind of look at it like a dynamic system. It is. It's not like this is the way information works and spreads, and this is how we should, like, you have one mental model for how it is. Because let's take an example where every journalist who reports is like perfect. They always reach out to that person for comment. They don't report anything until it's like, well, et cetera, et cetera. They're great. They're all great journalists. Okay. And you've never encountered any journalist who would ever like have an ulterior motive and, lie to you. You're naturally as human, like we as humans are habit forming, and your instinct is going to be lulled into complacency with journalism because you can always count on it. So your just trust level is naturally going to increase if the average level of competence is really high. So it's just naturally going to be the case because that's how we as humans are. And then that just creates more opportunity for bad actors. The higher the average level of trust is, the more opportunity for someone to lie to people and have them believe it. So it's sort of like a dynamic system. And I would say where we're at right now is probably like, I don't want to say an all-time low, but a pretty like far low level of trust in journalism and institutions, at least on maybe with people who disagree with you anyway. Not maybe you still trust your side heavily, but in terms of trusting like other people to be acting in good faith, it's pretty low right now. I'm not that old, so I can't pretend to know what it was like a long time ago. But at least in my life, it feels like we're approaching a trough. But I think ultimately, what I hope that will create is, like you said, John, is, well, now I just take everything with a grain of salt. I don't trust any of these people. And that sort of discipline is going to make it harder and harder for people to lie and create narratives or whatever, just mislead people. And then ultimately that should, make it more profitable if you're being diligent and doing a good job. And
I agree with all of that, as long as there's still a threshold for which you will accept new information. So if you come into everything with such a high degree of skepticism that you can't so like Jeff, off camera we talk about Bayesian statistics all the time. You come in with your priors, you get new information, you update to your posteriors. If those priors are so strong that no amount of additional data is going to update those opinions, then your priors, then you're not learning. Then you're just, you have made no progress. If you're still willing, with some level of information, to update beliefs based on information that you've seen, then I think if you set a high threshold for that, that's like the best case scenario, where you're basically saying, I am not going to be so whimsical that anything I hear is going to vastly change my opinion. I generally am going to trust my decades of life experience, but there are still things in my life that I can learn and then adjust those opinions of because I've now received new information. I think that is like the desired state that we should all be at. I don't think we're all necessarily there. I think most society is not there, but I think like that's the goal. So I agree with both of you, especially John. I think everyone should approach things with skepticism. I think the mistake a lot of people make is choosing to be so skeptical that they effectively refuse to update any of their existing beliefs. And that to me is not skepticism, that is just outright denial. So I think that as long as you kind of find that balance, I think that's like the appropriate way to take in new information, especially when like it is hard in this day and age for anyone to filter information. Like the smartest people in the world also have trouble in filtering information when evolutionarily, like humans have not had this much information at their fingertips ever until like right now.
I would agree, and I would just add that it is not only so hard, so difficult to fact check information, but it's also so easy to find counter arguments to anything that you find that it makes it even easier to stick to your priors because you can find something that's counter to whatever story you're hearing in the current media, which will allow you to very easily stick to your prior beliefs and make it even more difficult for people to update their opinions on any matter.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Jack. And I think you're right. There is probably some optimum level of Bayesian reasoning where it's like you're essentially assigning the right probabilities to holding your belief and updating them. Um, but I think that's something it's ultimately up to the individual and something everyone needs to work on themselves. It's like, there is sort of like an optimum healthiness, right? And like eating healthier and working out more will get you there. It's just on the individual to do it. Like I don't really necessarily see any way to fix that. And I would say social media, the internet, and we talked about this a little bit on one of our podcasts before where we talked about social media. It's still new. It's still fresh, you know, to people, especially social media. It's like 10 years old, kind of like really, even less so if you talk about like true popularity maybe, to the level it is now. And, you know, I think people are still learning how it affects us and still like it's we're not going to figure it all at once. Like it took a long time for people to realize like cigarettes were bad for them, you know. And so I don't know. I think it's going to take time. It's still fresh to the human race. This age of information. Um, and I'm optimistic that we'll improve. Honestly, over time, we'll get better at dealing with this.
Yeah, um, just to like bring it full circle, so that concept of like healthiness of like a society's data appetite or like news appetite, um, it's almost like you could objectively measure that, and then you could say like, and Dale, what you were saying, like, oh, um, the fact that you can read counterexamples to your to like reiterate the things that you think that are wrong, that's a sign of unhealthiness. Just like someone with like high blood pressure or someone who smokes cigarettes. So it's like pointing to those things, you can easily say like, oh, that's not efficient data transfer in a society, and you can say, oh, that's unhealthy. But the problem, so that's one aspect, and then the other aspect is, so once you recognize there is a problem, you don't have to address it. Like it can solve itself, it could not solve itself, which would eventually solve itself because then everyone that can't get information will just like die off. um, so it's like that's not something you have to address. What you have to address is the information that's leading to aggression. So it's like when a society is very unhealthy in its data appetite, you should look around and say, I think it's time to lower the weapons that we have at each other, which through political, like war and through political attacks. It's like that's what we got to pull back from. We don't have to increase the healthiness of data because, like, you can't really just do that. Like, there's no objective. Oh, this direction is healthier. Like everyone has their own incentive structure that's going to think, that how they can become healthier at ingesting news. So the real bottom line is like even as unhealthy as our society is at ingesting news, the action to take is to reduce the aggression that we have on each other and be peaceful in some way.
I like that.
If only though. I feel like we're just more and more at each other's throats. I don't know.
All right.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything else to say? I think
I could get philosophical, talk about my favorite philosopher, Edmund Gettier. He talks about knowledge, where there's three elements of make knowledge up. It's justified, true belief that is sensitive to the truth. So in order to truly know something, it has to be justified. The logic which you take to actually know something has to make sense. You can't just like guess and be right and then consider that knowledge. It has to be true. If you are wrong about something, you don't have knowledge about something. But then the most importantly, that's sensitive to belief or sensitive to the truth. So if you are wrong, would you then acknowledge that you are wrong? And I think that's what ties most important to this like whole news conversation. When I hear about sources that are trustworthy and not trustworthy, to me, almost the biggest sign of trust is sources admitting mistakes when they've made mistakes, which is like the biggest paradox to me in the modern consumption of media is that nowadays when a source makes a mistake and acknowledges it, they just get hounded on Twitter. And it's like, wait a minute. That's a good thing. Like, if they admit they're wrong, we should be happy that they're wrong, that they admitted that they're wrong, because it means that when they're right, we are, even if you're still skeptical, slightly more inclined to believe that they're right. Whereas if you see someone who is proven wrong, double down, it makes it very hard to believe them, even if they are right in the situation. And so that is my philosophical.
I totally agree.
It's the get at your problem. It's one of my favorite things.
I don't want to extend this too much longer, but the counterpoint, or not the counterpoint, but like the other side of what you're talking about, like admitting your mistakes. The internet, or at least digital media, has created the opportunity to do something called stealth editing, where people just essentially, if they get something wrong, they go back and edit it, but don't say they edited it.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's if admitting your mistakes is a sign of trust, which I agree with, then that's a sign of like someone you should not trust if they're not owning up to their.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So I guess the irony is like the more that someone has pointed out their mistruths in the past, the more you can believe them. They'll point it out if they know they're wrong.
I like that.